Right before he died, the famous TV host Ed Sullivan told everyone a big secret. He said the names of 6 singers he really didn't like. Sullivan was known for helping musicians become super famous. So when people heard his list, everyone was shocked. Who were these singers and why didn't he like them? Get ready to learn about the dark secrets of this music star's final words, Elvis Presley. In American TV history, there are few moments as famous or as shocking as when Elvis Presley sang on The Ed Sullivan Show. But behind the cameras, getting Elvis on the show wasn't easy at all. The man in charge, Ed Sullivan himself, really didn't want the young rock singer on his TV show at first, and he had good reasons for feeling this way. Sullivan was a big deal on American TV in the 1950s and 60s. His Sunday night show introduced millions of families to new musicians, comedians, actors, and fun acts. But Sullivan was also a man who followed strict rules and old-fashioned values. His TV program was made for families to watch together, and he protected its good reputation like a guard protecting a castle. So when Elvis Presley became famous, across the country with his rock music, blues singing, and especially his shocking hip movements, Sullivan wasn't just unsure about him. He was scared. At that time, Elvis had already caused trouble on other TV shows like The Milton Berle Show and The Steve Allen Show. On Berle's show in June 1956, Elvis sang Hound Dog and did big hip movements and slow grinding dances. The performance made many old-fashioned viewers, parents, and church leaders very angry. Critics called his act dirty, like an animal, and inappropriate. Sullivan, who always worried about his image and wanted to keep his show nice and clean, noticed this and said publicly that he would never invite Elvis on his stage. But Ed Sullivan's strong feelings would soon be tested by one thing that often beats moral anger in show business: TV ratings. The American people couldn't get enough of Elvis Presley. His performances might have shocked the grown-ups, but they made millions of teenagers and young adults very excited. When Elvis appeared on The Steve Allen Show after the Berle trouble, that program got huge viewership, beating Sullivan's own ratings that night. That was the turning point. Sullivan's producer, Marlo Lewis, started to see the money opportunity and told Sullivan to think again. Money talks, and soon so did Sullivan. In a very public change of mind, the host offered Elvis a contract for 3 appearances on The Eddie Sullivan Show for the huge amount of $50,000, the most money ever paid to a performer on that program at the time. But even when he gave in, Sullivan set rules. He made it clear that Elvis's performances would be watched closely, and that the cameras would not show any offensive lower body movements. When Elvis made his first appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show on September 9, 1956, he performed Don't Be Cruel, Love Me Tender, and Hound Dog. The show had about 60 million viewers, a huge 82.6% of everyone watching TV that night. The performance, though slightly calmed down compared to his earlier shows, still excited the crowd and made him a superstar. Sullivan, may be surprised by the good reaction and the massive ratings, began to change his mind. He invited Elvis back for 2 more appearances, October 28, 1956, and January 6, 1957. During these later performances, Presley seemed more careful about his movements and acted with more control, but the power of his charm and voice couldn't be stopped by camera angles or rules. By the time of his final appearance on the show, Sullivan had become somewhat of a believer. After Presley's closing performance in January 1957, Sullivan turned to the camera and said, "This is a real good, fine boy. And wherever you go, Elvis, we want you to know that you have the real support of The Ed Sullivan Show." It was an amazing statement considering Sullivan's earlier refusal to have the singer on at all. But it also showed a bigger truth about American TV in the 1950s. Things were changing. The culture was moving quickly, led by young people who wanted music that showed their feelings, their rebellion, and their rhythm. Elvis Presley was the perfect example of that change, and Ed Sullivan, knowing it or not, helped bring it into America's living rooms. Funny enough, while Sullivan had tried to control Presley's energy, the very act of having him on the show gave rock and roll a kind of respect. The Ed Sullivan Show had long been a guard of what was normal in culture. By showing Elvis, the show became a doorway to something new, something more exciting, more daring, and more youth-focused than anything that had come before. And the lasting effect of those performances is hard to overstate. For Elvis, appearing on Sullivan's show wasn't just a boost in popularity. It was like being crowned king of the nation. He became not just a teen idol, but a cultural force. His title as the King of Rock and Roll wasn't officially given by Sullivan, but the platform Sullivan provided certainly helped put him on the throne. For Sullivan, the episodes with Elvis became some of the most famous in the show's long history. Despite his early reluctance, he eventually accepted Presley's place in American entertainment. In doing so, he also helped redefine what was possible on television, setting the stage, quite literally, for decades of musical innovation to follow. Buddy Holly. In the group of early rock and roll legends, Buddy Holly stands out as one of the music style's most important pioneers. With his thick-rimmed glasses, hiccup singing style, and hits that changed music like Peggy Sue and That'll Be the Day, Holly helped shape the sound and spirit of 1950s rock. But his quick rise to fame wasn't without problems, especially when it came to the era's most powerful tastemaker, Ed Sullivan. Their meeting wasn't just a rising star meeting an established media giant. It was a fight between old and young, rebellion and control, youth and establishment. And things got really bad on an unlucky night when Buddy Holly and his band, the Crickets, appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. By the time Buddy Holly was invited to appear on Sullivan's famous Sunday night variety show, The Ed Sullivan Show had already become a national treasure. With a huge weekly audience, the program was America's top showcase for new talent. A performance on Sullivan's stage could make a career just as it had for artists like Elvis Presley. But the opportunity came with strings attached. Sullivan was known for being deeply involved in every part of the show's production. He approved song lists, censored lyrics, and controlled stage presentation with careful and often heavy control. He held firm to his values, trying to make sure the content of his show stayed suitable for middle-class family viewers. That didn't always work well with the new breed of musicians who were beginning to challenge the old ways. And few artists showed that new spirit of independent-minded rock like Buddy Holly. Holly's trouble with Sullivan began with the choice of song. The Crickets were scheduled to perform their hit single, Oh Boy, a song that had already proven popular with teenagers across the country. But Sullivan had a problem with it. He reportedly found certain lyrics to be suggestive, particularly the line, All of my love, all of my kissing, you don't know what you've been a-missing. While tame by today's standards, such words in 1958 were enough to worry more old-fashioned audiences, and Sullivan was nothing if not old-fashioned. Sullivan demanded that Holly replace Oh Boy with a different, less provocative song. But Buddy Holly, already known for his quiet confidence and no-nonsense attitude, refused. He wasn't about to let a television host tell him what music he could or couldn't play. He insisted that he and the Crickets would perform Oh Boy as planned or not at all. This defiance made Sullivan furious. He had a reputation for not taking well to artists who challenged his authority. From that moment on, the relationship between the two men got much worse. As the show got closer, the atmosphere backstage was tense and unfriendly. Sullivan reportedly treated Holly coldly, not giving him the usual kindness extended to his guests. Some stories suggest that he deliberately made the band's sound levels quieter, making their performance harder to hear on television. A mean move meant to punish Holly for not listening to him. Despite the backstage drama and the cold attitude, from Sullivan, Buddy Holly and the Crickets gave a spirited performance. On January 26, 1958, they took the stage and started Oh Boy, with the same energy and enthusiasm that had made them stars. Though the sound mix may have been quieter than usual, Holly's charm and musical skills still managed to shine through. The studio audience responded enthusiastically, and viewers at home were impressed. For many teenagers watching, the performance confirmed what they already believed. Buddy Holly wasn't just another singer. He was the real deal. His unpolished charm, raw sound, and refusal to bow to censorship gave him street credibility in a way few performers had at the time. After the performance, Sullivan reportedly snubbed Holly once more. According to members of the Crickets, Sullivan gave only a half-hearted handshake and never invited the band back again. The experience left a bitter taste for Holly, who had hoped the appearance would be a career milestone, not a power struggle. Nevertheless, the moment had a lasting impact. Buddy Holly's uncompromising stance elevated his image among fans. At a time when many artists were willing to bend to the will of gatekeepers, Holly stood his ground. In doing so, he demonstrated the growing power of youth culture and helped to define the rebellious spirit that would characterize rock and roll in the years to come. While he may have clashed with one of television's most powerful figures, Holly's place in music history was already secured. Tragically, his life and career were cut short just a year later, when he died in a plane crash at the age of 22. But his influence continues to affect generations of musicians, from the Beatles to Bruce Springsteen to modern indie rockers. The tension between Buddy Holly and Ed Sullivan wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. It represented a bigger shift happening in American culture. The breaking down of old-fashioned respectability in favor of something more real, more personal, and more free. Sullivan saw himself as a protector of public decency. But in trying to preserve that ideal, he often clashed with artists who were simply expressing the changing values of their time. Buddy Holly, with his stubborn honesty and belief in artistic freedom, became a hero to a generation that was starting to demand more than polished smiles and harmless songs. Bob Dylan. In the early 1960s, as the American cultural landscape was beginning to shift dramatically, few artists captured the emerging spirit of protest, intellectualism, and poetic rebellion more clearly than Bob Dylan. With his harmonica, acoustic guitar, and gravelly voice, Dylan was quickly becoming the voice of a generation tired of conformity, war, and political lies. But his rise to national fame didn't come without its share of fights. One of the most important early moments in Dylan's career involved an unexpected standoff with none other than Ed Sullivan, the undisputed gatekeeper of mainstream American television. By 1963, The Ed Sullivan Show had become the single most important platform for entertainers hoping to reach a mass audience. Appearances on Sullivan's program had shot stars like Elvis Presley and the Beatles into superstardom. At just 21 years old, Bob Dylan was invited to perform on the show, a major opportunity to reach millions of American viewers and introduce his distinctive blend of folk, satire, and protest music to the mainstream. Dylan accepted the invitation and planned to perform "Talkin' John Birch Paranoid Blues," a biting satirical song aimed at the ultra-conservative paranoia of the John Birch Society, a far-right group known for seeing communist conspiracies everywhere. In the song, Dylan adopts the voice of a narrator so obsessed with finding communists that he begins to suspect everyone around him, from teachers to civil rights activists to even the mailman. The lyrics were exaggerated and silly, but the message was clear. Dylan was making fun of the wild, unreasonable fear of communism that had gripped large parts of America in the wake of McCarthyism and the Cold War. During rehearsals for the May 12, 1963 live broadcast, Ed Sullivan himself didn't raise any objections to the song. In fact, according to reports, he seemed amused by Dylan's performance and gave it a quiet nod of approval. However, network executives at CBS, worried about potential lawsuits or backlash from right-wing viewers, stepped in at the last minute. CBS lawyer told Dylan that "Talkin' John Birch Paranoid Blues" would not be allowed to air unless he changed the lyrics or picked a different song entirely. The network feared that even in a joking context, the song could be viewed as mean or offensive to the actual John Birch Society. For Dylan, the request represented a red line. Instead of compromising or agreeing to swap out the song, as many young performers might have done for a chance at national fame, he simply refused. According to multiple accounts, Dylan responded firmly, "If I can't play my song, I'm not going to play at all." And just like that, he walked off the show, leaving Sullivan, the producers, and the network stunned. Dylan's decision to walk away from the opportunity made headlines. Many in the press praised his stand as an act of artistic courage. At a time when political and social tensions were rising, the civil rights movement was gaining momentum, and U.S. involvement in Vietnam was beginning to escalate. Dylan's refusal to bow to censorship was seen by many young Americans as a bold, even heroic move. He wasn't just another entertainer. He was emerging as a truth-teller, someone who wouldn't let corporate interests dictate his voice or values. In the immediate aftermath, CBS aired a statement suggesting the conflict had been a misunderstanding, but the damage, or perhaps the legend, was already done. Far from hurting his career, Dylan's walkout amplified his credibility. The press coverage helped introduce his music and political views to a wider audience. What might have been a standard performance became a defining episode that reinforced his image as a rebel poet, unafraid to challenge institutions or speak uncomfortable truths. This wasn't Dylan's first or last brush with controversy, but it was one of the earliest and most public examples of his uncompromising artistic honesty. The fight with CBS and Ed Sullivan's show signaled something deeper. Dylan didn't just want to entertain. He wanted to provoke, to question, and to disrupt. In a culture where entertainers were expected to smile and go along, his refusal to conform stood out like a thunderclap. Over the following years, Dylan's lyrics would only grow more politically and socially charged. Songs like Masters of War, The Times They Are A-Changin', and Blowin' in the Wind would become anthems for anti-war activists, civil rights protesters, and disappointed youth around the world. The Ed Sullivan Show walkout became an early chapter in the larger story of Dylan's evolution from folk singer to cultural icon. Interestingly, Ed Sullivan himself, while not directly responsible for banning the song, was said to have been supportive of Dylan's position. According to some sources, Sullivan admired Dylan's talent and later expressed disappointment that the network had interfered. But regardless of where Sullivan personally stood, the incident highlighted a growing split between television's safe, cleaned-up version of America and the raw, restless reality that artists like Dylan were beginning to explore. The Beatles. In the vast timeline of rock and roll history, few moments are as huge as the Beatles' 1964 debut on The Ed Sullivan Show. Often credited with starting the British invasion, their appearance on American television signaled a cultural transformation. Millions of Americans, especially teenagers, watched in awe as four mop-topped young men from Liverpool strummed guitars, harmonized perfectly, and sent girls into fits of screaming excitement. It was a moment that changed music, media, and celebrity culture forever. And standing at the center of this historic introduction was Ed Sullivan himself, the serious and famously unsmiling host who accidentally opened the floodgates to a revolution he didn't entirely understand. Sullivan had built his variety show into a national institution by the early 1960s. Known for his wooden delivery and rigid stage presence, he prided himself on offering wholesome, family-oriented entertainment. The Ed Sullivan Show launched countless stars from Elvis Presley to the Supremes to Topo Gigio the Mouse. But Sullivan was also a smart businessman. While he often made decisions based on personal taste or values, he also had a keen eye for what audiences wanted. In 1963, while returning from a trip to London's Heathrow Airport, Sullivan witnessed a chaotic scene. Hundreds of screaming teenagers mobbing the terminal. The cause of the frenzy, a band called the Beatles. Sullivan hadn't heard of them, but he knew what he was seeing. massive star power. The screaming teens reminded him of the fan hysteria that had surrounded Elvis nearly a decade earlier. Sullivan wasted no time. Upon returning to the U.S., he asked his bookers to secure this band immediately, sensing a cultural tidal wave was on its way. Though the band had not yet broken in the U.S., Sullivan offered the Beatles a then-generous deal: 3 consecutive Sunday night appearances in February 1964. It was a gamble, but it paid off. By the time of their American debut, Beatlemania had started to spread stateside, aided by the success of "I Want to Hold Your Hand," which had recently topped the Billboard charts. On February 9, 1964, over 73 million Americans tuned in to see the Beatles perform live on The Ed Sullivan Show. That number represented roughly 34% of the U.S. population at the time. It was one of the most watched television broadcasts in history, and certainly the most influential musical performance ever aired up to that point. Girls screamed, boys took notes, and parents stared warily at the band's shaggy haircuts and mischievous grins. That night, the Beatles performed "All My Loving," "Till There Was You," "She Loves You," and closed with "I Want to Hold Your Hand." While Sullivan appeared enthusiastic on camera, famously introducing them with the words, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles," behind the scenes there was occasional tension. Ed Sullivan was by all accounts a traditionalist. He preferred polished, respectful performers who didn't challenge decorum or stir too much chaos. With Elvis, he had already dealt with the cultural backlash of provocative performances to the point of censoring camera angles. With the Beatles, the controversy was less about sexuality and more about the chaos they inspired. The sheer volume of Beatlemania unnerved Sullivan and his production team. The shrieking crowds, the surging teenagers, the endless media coverage. It felt like a phenomenon that was veering out of control. Sullivan reportedly found their haircuts ridiculous and occasionally expressed disapproval of their cheeky attitudes during rehearsals. The Beatles' irreverent humor, especially John Lennon's sarcastic wit, occasionally clashed with the more buttoned-up tone Sullivan preferred for his show. One story tells of Sullivan insisting on tight control over the band's set list and presentation. There were concerns about security, crowd control, and live broadcast integrity. The producers were worried that the screaming might drown out the music, and at times it nearly did. Technicians were forced to adjust microphones and sound levels to ensure the broadcast could be understood by those at home. Yet despite any personal reservations, Sullivan recognized gold when he saw it. He may not have been able to predict the long-term cultural ramifications, but he knew that the Beatles were a ratings juggernaut. Each of their 3 performances on his show shattered viewing records and brought in a youthful demographic that advertisers drooled over. Sullivan, always calculating, leaned into the frenzy, even if it unsettled him. And to their credit, the Beatles were respectful guests. Though they joked around in interviews and backstage, they understood the importance of the platform they had been given. They played by the rules, more or less, and even dressed in tailored suits for their performances, in contrast to the later psychedelic styles they would embrace. Sullivan admired their professionalism and soon recognized that despite their rebellious aura, they were disciplined musicians who understood the business. As the 1960s progressed and the Beatles grew more experimental, politically outspoken, and visually unconventional, their appearances on Sullivan's show became less frequent. The program, which had helped launch them into superstardom, began to feel out of sync with the ever-changing cultural currents. Still, the bond between the band and Sullivan remained respectful. They made a few more appearances over the years, including video performances after they stopped touring in 1966. For Ed Sullivan, the decision to showcase the Beatles may have come with some discomfort and backstage headaches, but it also cemented his legacy. Just as he had once introduced Elvis to a skeptical American public, he had once again acted as a bridge between old and new, tradition and transformation. The Beatles' success on The Ed Sullivan Show didn't just launch their careers in the U.S., it signaled the dawn of a new era in music, media, and youth culture. James Brown. By the mid-20th century, The Ed Sullivan Show had become the definitive launchpad for aspiring stars hoping to reach millions of American households. Ed Sullivan himself, a former newspaper columnist turned television host, was known for his rigid demeanor and commitment to presenting family-friendly entertainment. For nearly 2 decades, Sullivan served as a kind of cultural gatekeeper, deciding who was suitable for America's living rooms. But as music evolved, especially with the rise of rock, soul, and rhythm and blues, Sullivan increasingly found himself at odds with performers whose intensity and artistry challenged the conservative norms of the time. Among those who tested the boundaries of Sullivan's sensibilities was the electrifying, unstoppable force of nature. James Brown. James Brown, known as the godfather of soul, was not just a singer. He was a revolution in motion. His high-octane performances combined gospel-fueled vocals, frantic dancing, shout-singing, and a command of the stage that bordered on spiritual possession. Clad in dazzling outfits and backed by a razor-sharp band, Brown's shows were an experience. Raw, passionate, and unapologetically black. In an era still defined by racial divisions and cultural caution, Brown's presence on mainstream television was a radical act in itself. Though Brown was undeniably a crowd puller, his relationship with Ed Sullivan and his show was complicated. While Sullivan had a history of featuring black performers on his stage, such as the Supremes, Nat King Cole, and Louis Armstrong, his comfort level varied based on the style and energy of the act. He preferred artists who were polished, well-rehearsed, and restrained in stage presence. Brown was none of those things by design. His entire philosophy was built around breaking through stiffness and formality, replacing it with something thrilling, soulful, and deeply physical. Reports suggest that Sullivan was visibly uncomfortable with Brown's intensity, particularly his explosive dancing, guttural vocals, and flamboyant stage antics. Brown's signature moves, such as the full splits, spins, and sweat-drenched mic throws, defied the kind of conservative showmanship Sullivan prized. Unlike other guests who simply stood at a microphone and crooned to the camera, Brown turned the stage into a battlefield of rhythm and emotion. For Sullivan, this level of unrestrained physicality was at best unpredictable and at worst inappropriate for a general audience. When Brown did appear on The Ed Sullivan Show, his presence was carefully managed. He was asked to tone down certain elements of his performance, and producers worked to frame his appearances in a way that would minimize controversy. There was an unspoken pressure to make Brown's electrifying presence more palatable to white, middle-class viewers. But Brown, never one to compromise his vision, pushed back against those limits whenever he could. The tension between Sullivan's traditional values and Brown's revolutionary energy reflected a larger cultural conflict. America in the 1960s was undergoing massive changes. Civil rights protests, anti-war movements, and generational upheaval were shaking the foundation of the old status quo. Brown represented the new America, bold, political, emotional, and uncontainable. His music, songs like Papa's Got a Brand New Bag and I Got You, I Feel Good, carried a pulse that couldn't be silenced by tighter camera angles or polite applause. Though Sullivan may have been unsettled by Brown's approach, he couldn't deny the power of the performance. Audiences responded viscerally to Brown. His appearances, however brief or compromised, generated tremendous buzz and proved that viewers were ready, eager even, for something that felt real and raw. Brown was not just a performer. He was a symbol of cultural progression, particularly for black audiences who rarely saw themselves represented with such power and pride on national television. One of the most defining aspects of James Brown's career was his refusal to shrink himself, to fit someone else's vision. And while Sullivan's show may have tried to limit him, Brown made sure that even a few minutes of screen time left an unforgettable impression. In later interviews, Brown acknowledged the challenges of performing for white institutions like Sullivan's show, but he also recognized their importance in bringing his message to broader audiences. As he once said, "If I got a few seconds to show the world what we're about, I'm going to use every bit of it." Over time, Sullivan seemed to acknowledge Brown's place in American culture, even if he never fully embraced his style. While their relationship was never warm, Sullivan's willingness to feature Brown, despite personal misgivings, was a recognition that the times were changing, and artists like James Brown were leading that charge. It was an uneasy alliance, but a necessary one. James Brown's legacy today is undisputed. He's credited with laying the groundwork for funk, influencing countless artists in soul, hip-hop, and rock, and for being one of the greatest live performers in music history. His brief but unforgettable appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show stand as evidence of his relentless drive to break barriers, even when those barriers were maintained by one of the most influential figures in entertainment television. Other rock and roll artists. Ed Sullivan's long-running variety show was one of the most influential platforms in American television history, and with that power came a certain responsibility, at least in Sullivan's mind, to uphold what he saw as the moral and cultural standards of mainstream America. A staunch conservative and devout Catholic, Sullivan was deeply cautious when it came to content that could be perceived as provocative, rebellious, or too far removed from traditional entertainment values. As a result, he frequently found himself at odds with a new wave of performers who were challenging the status quo, particularly those from the burgeoning rock and roll scene. The mid-1950s and 1960s were a period of seismic change in American culture. Teenagers were asserting their identity in ways that unnerved the older generation. Rock and roll music, with its suggestive lyrics, gyrating dance moves, and unfiltered energy, became a symbol of this cultural shift. For someone like Ed Sullivan, who prided himself on maintaining a program that was suitable for the entire family, this posed a dilemma. On the one hand, these new acts were undeniably popular and brought in massive ratings. On the other, they threatened the wholesome image he had cultivated for his show. Sullivan's approach to rock and roll artists was often a mix of wariness, pragmatism, and at times reluctant tolerance. He didn't necessarily dislike rock and roll as a genre, but he was suspicious of the behavior and cultural shifts associated with it. He worried about promoting acts that could be seen as too rebellious or sexually suggestive. If an artist's stage presence or lyrics pushed the boundaries of what Sullivan considered acceptable, he wasn't shy about taking action. He might demand a change in lyrics, restrict camera angles to avoid controversial dance moves, or refuse to book the act altogether. This cautious approach led to several now infamous moments of conflict. Perhaps the most legendary example is his initial resistance to booking Elvis Presley. Sullivan was deeply uncomfortable with Presley's signature hip gyrations and overtly sexual performance style. While Presley had already become a sensation by the time Sullivan relented and invited him on the show, Sullivan made it a condition that Elvis would only be filmed from the waist up, an attempt to tone down the shock value of his act for the television audience. Even so, Presley's appearance was a massive success and propelled him to even greater fame. For Sullivan, the ratings win was undeniable, even if it came at the cost of compromising his personal standards. But Elvis was far from the only rock and roll artist to butt heads with Sullivan or to feel the effects of his conservative filter. Artists like Jerry Lee Lewis, the Rolling Stones, and the Doors all had their run-ins with Sullivan's producers or Sullivan himself. In each case, the pattern was the same: a performance deemed too provocative or lyrics seen as inappropriate led to attempts at censorship or outright cancellations. Some artists played along, changing their lyrics or toning down their act to secure the national exposure. Others, like Jim Morrison of the Doors, refused, famously singing the word "higher" in "Light My Fire," despite being asked not to. Morrison's Defiance reportedly enraged Sullivan, who vowed never to have the band back on his show. There were also lesser-known artists who simply never got the chance to appear. If Sullivan or his producers believed an act might offend their core audience, the invitation was never extended. Many African-American performers who blended gospel, soul, and R&B into more intense or passionate displays were viewed with skepticism. While Sullivan did help promote several black artists, including the Supremes, Jackie Wilson, and Sam Cooke, he was selective about who got the nod and often expected a certain level of restraint in their presentation. Those who leaned too heavily into the raw emotional energy of rock and soul were sometimes deemed unsuitable. Yet for all his resistance and conservatism, Sullivan couldn't ignore the cultural shift forever. The demand from young audiences and the ratings that followed meant he had to make compromises. He begrudgingly allowed more and more rock and roll acts onto his stage, and in doing so played an undeniable role in legitimizing the genre in the eyes of mainstream America. For many of the performers he initially clashed with, an appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show was still a dream come true, a rite of passage that often launched their careers to the next level. The duality of Ed Sullivan's approach, at once gatekeeper and reluctant kingmaker, is a fascinating reflection of the tension between old and new in American pop culture. While he certainly acted as a barrier for some artists, his show nonetheless helped propel rock and roll into the national spotlight. Whether by promoting artists like Elvis and the Beatles or clashing with them over style and substance, Sullivan was at the center of a cultural evolution he couldn't always control and sometimes didn't even understand. What do you think about the 6 singers that Ed Sullivan hates the most? Leave us your comments in the section below. We hope you have found this helpful video. Don't forget to leave a like, share, and subscribe to the channel if you like it. Thank you for watching this, and see you in the next videos. Goodbye.